Although most art is visual, we use our ears to admire one of the most prominent forms of art in the world, music. Chances are, however, you haven't quite heard the kind of music that Musica Transalpina has in store. Specializing in sacred music from the Baroque era, this ensemble performs some of the finest music ever written, most of which hasn't been heard for centuries. Today, we'll talk with Brian Roach, the ensemble's director, about just how this music is discovered and why it's important to bring it back into the stage and back into liturgy today. Brian, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I was a music major at university, and during the pandemic, I had the great opportunity to start a professional early music ensemble, which is what I've been doing for the past 3.5 years. I was always interested, ever since grade school, in history on one hand and classical music on the other, ever since I was very young. Both subjects really fascinated me. So I think it was a natural consequence that I would want to study or focus on the history of music, specifically sacred music.
Why is that? Why specifically sacred music?
Well, in general, if you look at the history of music, let's say before the year 1800, if you compare secular music to sacred music, generally the sacred music, from a purely artistic standpoint, is qualitatively much better in terms of the attention placed on how it was composed, how carefully it was put together, how, aesthetically, how artistically refined it is.
Was there a specific instance that you remember maybe in your childhood where you heard it and you said this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can you tell us about that?
It was at my parish as a kid. I was 13 years old and our rector was retiring. So they hired a professional choir and they sang the most sublime music I'd ever heard. It was layer upon layer of the most celestial melodies. And it was something completely unfamiliar to me. And as a 13-year-old with no musical background, it was like the most captivating melody that I'd heard. I remember my grandfather buying me a few albums of music by Thomas Tallis and other Tudor composers for my birthday. I was probably like 14 or something. And he said, well, I went to Barnes & Noble and I said, my grandson likes old music, like really old music. One comment I got, I remember from my neighbor, I hear Brian practicing on the piano, and it sounds nice, but he always plays the most like obscure sounding music. Why doesn't he play something nice by like Beethoven?
Wow. Do you ever feel backlash when that was happening?
I mean, my mother would say the same thing. Why can't you play like a Mozart piano sonata or something? It intellectually just didn't stimulate me the same way that like, say, 16th century English keyboard music did.
Now let's move on to the origins of Musica Transalpina. Okay, tell me about it. How did it all start?
I was approached by a priest of the Canons Regular of Prémontré who wanted to revive the very important legacy, patrimony that his order played in the promotion, the creation indeed, and the dissemination of the new Baroque musical style at the beginning of the Counter-Reformation. I was approached by this gentleman to create this ensemble, to put together some performances of large-scale liturgical music for some special events, some weddings, first mass of a newly ordained priest, and so on. It sort of snowballed from there. The response from the congregations was overwhelmingly positive, and the famously ambivalent musicians were so impressed that we were able to put this together, that I was able to put this together, that we very quickly declared it a nonprofit. And have been performing larger and larger and more important compositions from the golden age of church music.
How many people are part of the ensemble at the moment?
As opposed to most ensembles that will have a set number of people and then they'll find music to perform that fits their personnel, we take the opposite approach. We'll start with the composition and then we'll reverse engineer what specific instruments and voices we need, but we hire the leading interpreters of this style from across the world, really. I mean, we've flown people in from Italy and Austria, and we want to have the best musicians that we can find to do justice to these compositions that we're trying to bring back to life. We as an ensemble are focused on performing large-scale sacred music of the Baroque era. One of the reasons, one of our motivations for doing this is that is some of the least performed music of the Baroque era. We certainly do scale down if necessary. We've done a good handful of weddings, but what we've started doing is we've started to replicate these gigantic liturgical extravaganzas
Okay.
into concerts, so we can
Okay.
reach a wider audience.
I do want to take it back to the name, Musica Transalpina, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
What is the meaning of it? Because I know it's very specific meaning, right?
Well, it is a specific meaning, but I think it's extremely important. This music traveled out of Italy over the Alps, so to speak, Transalpina. So from the 1590s onwards, there was always a hungry market for this Italian style of sacred music, which to them, to people in Austria or in southern Germany or even northern Germany, even among the Lutherans, this style of music was immediately identifiable with Catholicism. One thing we need to remember about this time period, that we're talking the Baroque era, which is late 1500s to very early 1700s. Church and state were not considered to be separate entities. They were one and the same.
Okay.
So some of these really important festivals, like the Ascension, were also very important political events. So these masses were always accompanied by really stupendous liturgical music that was written specifically to be performed for that day, maybe never again.
What is the research like to bring them back?
If music during the late Renaissance or early Baroque period was not published, it was usually composed for an important event, like a coronation or even a funeral or a royal wedding. And then once this event was over, usually these compositions, which were just so large scale, they had no practical aftermarket, they would just shelve them if we were lucky. Otherwise, they'd throw them away. You know,
Yeah.
so a lot of the music that we perform survives in two main archives. One is in Bohemia and the other is in Austria. And this was because there were two bishops. One was a bishop, another was a monk, who really wanted to capture a snapshot of what music at the Habsburg court was like before it disappeared forever. Some of these compositions got a new lease on life. They'd be performed a second time, maybe a third time, you know, but it's also always after the fact.
Yeah.
And then they would archive them, thank goodness. It's a beautiful, small scale, large scale sacred compositions, both published and unpublished. So that's so valuable because so much of the unpublished stuff survives in those records.
What is something that you would say to others who are interested in this discipline and this type of art?
Well, this is a very academic field. So much of the Baroque music repertoire is sacred, but it's seldom ever performed liturgically. See, so there's just, I think, a lot of fertile territory for cross-pollination right there that I haven't seen too many people take advantage of.
And what is that process today? Do you think it's a growing community or?
No, the field of sacred music is shrinking for a number of reasons. To the extent that churches are growing, you have less of an emphasis on professional musicianship. They're less willing to have professional musicians because they don't have much of a culture of professional musicianship. Not anymore, whereas centuries ago they would have.
Now that's very, heartbreaking to hear because it's such beautiful art. What is something that you feel we could do to bring it back up?
There is a constant need for performing that music, bringing it back to life, and also informing people that it even exists. You can behold the monuments of Baroque sacred architecture, or the paintings of the Baroque era, or the sculpture of the Baroque era. But you can't just look at a score of sacred music from that same time period and hear it. You need someone to interpret that. You need someone to perform it. It's really important to cultivate a serious and professional musical program. I think it's really important for children to learn to sing. And if you look at the models from the Renaissance and the early Baroque periods, those choirs were filled with boys, lots of boys.
So basically, teaching the younger generation to keep it alive, right?
It's very important. Again, like I said, historically, it's important because so much of this music was performed by children. So if we can really emphasize musical education, especially when it comes to in a church environment, I think that would be a good thing for promoting sacred music and for ensuring that it will survive into the next generation.
How do you feel like your faith has influenced your art?
I'll make an analogy of looking at a beautiful painting in a museum that has no frame, and then maybe taking a step to the side and there's a beautiful frame with no art in it. It just adds another dimension that adds a lot more meaning to the music that otherwise would just be decorative. We had a performance, a very interesting passion setting. I was really intrigued by the response from our congregation, because they overwhelmingly preferred that to anything else we'd sung before. And I think it's that they were following along in their prayer books and they heard this very elaborate church music, but they were reading the translation attentively while the priest was intoning the narration.
It made him part of it.
It made them part of this really liturgical drama.
Yeah.
So that was really powerful for them.
So what is something that you wish people feel or get out of listening to this type of music?
To me, this music is the most exciting, enthralling, elaborate music ever. So my least favorite comment when I'd ask people, what'd you think? Was when they'd say, oh, it was so soothing. It was so relaxing. It was so, and I'd think, are you kidding me? This is so exciting. You don't think this music's exciting? I mean, if you are listening closely and you hear what those melodies are doing with each other, to me, it's like looking into a kaleidoscope. Like, there's nothing soothing about this. To me, it's like exhilarating.
Yeah.
I wish they'd be like, oh my gosh, what was that?
Yeah.
Which I think Baroque music is much more effective at provoking in people, especially when you have like a trumpet blare out of nowhere. I mean, that's stunning. It like wakes you up and there's like a timpani, like, whoa, drums in church? I thought that wasn't allowed. In the words of a benefactress of ours, you don't need to be Lutheran to appreciate the music of Bach. So you don't have to be a believer to appreciate the monuments of sacred music. Again, it's not relaxing. It's like magnificent. It's so exciting. It's so glorious.
How can we make it accessible?
Accessible, yeah. I think concerts are the best way.
Yeah.
People are a little bit less inclined to go to liturgical events, which is understandable. It helps us to be able to share this wonderful musical tradition that's almost completely forgotten to a wider audience. Able to reach more people, able to touch more hearts, change more lives. Like, it's changed mine. I would venture to say it's changed a lot of my own musicians' lives too. It's really like very important to me personally. And I think it can change a lot of people's lives for the better.
Brian, it has been such a pleasure getting to know you and your ensemble a little bit more, and for you guys to tell us the amount of research and work that you put into this craft.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I can really, really feel that passion that you have for what you do. And I hope that this also spreads to others who are viewing. And that next time that we're listening to this type of music, we allow it to really uplift us and touch our hearts.